Senate Bill 107 by Senator Gatti to provide for financial security for certain public employees, provide relative to workers' compensation.
Representative Stagney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a bill for our firefighters, volunteer firefighters, our police employees, medical emergency employees. Essentially, it streamlines the workers' comp process, and I think I have a technical amendment that I need to put on, Mr. Speaker.
Let's read in the amendment, Madam Clerk.
The technical amendment offered by Representative Stagney is number 2921.
Is there any objection to the adoption of the technical amendment? Without objection, the amendment is adopted. Next amendment, Madam Clerk.
Next set of floor amendments is by Representative McGee. The set is 3403, one-page set of amendments.
Representative McGee on your amendment.
Thank you, members. This amendment simply removes a evidentiary standard that was placed in there of preponderance in the evidence and lets it go to its normal evidentiary standard.
There are no questions on the amendment. For the floor on the amendment, Representative Seabaugh.
Members, this is a good bill. Came before the House Labor Committee, and one of the problems was that the way the bill was originally drafted, there were presumptions. And what essentially the bill is trying to do is cover certain people, first responders, to allow them to make workers' comp claims for post-traumatic stress disorder, which is fine. I think we're all for that. The problem was the way the bill was originally drafted, there was a presumption that if you worked for the fire department, then and you were diagnosed with PTSD, it was presumed to be related to your employment. If you were the chief's secretary and you had PTSD because of something completely non-work related, there was a presumption that it was related to your employment. And what we did in committee is we added language in which the preponderance of evidence indicates that the event was a substantial contributing factor. So essentially, we added language that said you have to show by preponderance of the evidence that the event which caused your PTSD was related to your employment. And that's what this amendment seeks to strip out. It seeks to strip out the by preponderance of the evidence that it was related to your employment. So essentially what it would be doing, I think, is trying to put back the presumption that if you work for the fire department and you're diagnosed with PTSD, it's presumed to be related to your employment and you don't have to actually prove it. And again, this was a compromise that was made in committee. And we could have killed the bill in committee. We didn't. We added this language because on the whole, it's a good bill. It was just way too broad. So we worked out the language in committee, and we came to agreement with this language that was in the amendment that they're now trying to strip part of it out. So I would oppose the amendment. It's a good bill with the language as it is. With the amendment, if the amendment gets on, I'm not sure how good of a bill it is. And I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Miguez, is your question for Representative
Seabaugh? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Seabaugh, appreciate you going to the floor and mention those items because that's how I remembered in committee. This is a good bill. We wanted to help our firemen, but we wanted to make sure that the bill was narrowly tailored and do what its intended purpose was. Did you know?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, we were essentially trying to make sure that it's related to their employment.
Do you remember a discussion with me? We didn't want to reinvent the wheel. We looked at the Texas statute, our neighboring state, where in their code they include the preponderance of the evidence indicates that the firefighters or peace officers' work was a substantial contributing factor of the disorder. And we used that language. The author agreed to that language. Do you remember that?
That's correct. Everybody at the table agreed to it.
And it was our intent that this would remain in this posture, and we passed this bill through the process. So I'm disappointed, did you know, to see that this is being stripped off. My next question would be to Representative McGee, did the author ask for this amendment? The author...
Wait, yeah, we'll get him to the mic in a minute.
I'd like to ask him. I'm good. I'd like to ask him a question.
Press your question button again when he's back on the mic.
Okay, so Representative Seabaugh, to recap, you remember an agreement from the author to keep the bill in this posture. He agreed to this language of the preponderance of the evidence, which was in the Texas statute, as well as some of the other language that dealt with during the course and scope of the firefighter or peace officer's employment. Do you remember that?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so my next question would be for Representative McGee, whenever the appropriate time is, Speaker.
For a question, Representative Jefferson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Seabaugh, Representative Miguez just posed you a few queries as it relates to you had an agreement with the author that he would leave the bill in the posture that it came out of labor. Is that correct?
Yeah, I believe when we were putting all the language in, we amended it kind of on the fly.
That's correct.
Yeah, and we were doing the amendments on the fly, but he agreed to the language, and
Well,
yeah,
I think-
as far as my recollection was, yes, that we agreed to the language, and that was the extent of it.
Okay, did you know that my recollection was that there was no agreement per se? My recollection was that you proposed the amendment per se, and things happened so quickly. Did you know that we wanted to make sure that we were doing the appropriate and the right thing, and so it happened so quickly. But I don't remember, and I was sitting there in the chair, that there was an agreement as relates to keep the bill in the posture as it is right now. Do you know?
Well, I don't know what you recall. That's the way I remembered it.
Okay, well, I was just in the room, and it's always good to get a lot of different opinions as it relates to what is being heard and what is being stated, because you said on a number of occasions that it was a good bill. Is that correct?
It is a good bill, and I do support the bill, even if the amendment gets on. I think it's a better bill as it is now, but even if this amendment gets on, I'm still going to support the bill. It's a good bill. I think it's a little bit problematic putting the presumption back in. When I think if you're filing a workers' comp claim and you're going to make these municipalities bear the expenses of paying these workers' compensation benefits, that we need to make sure that the benefits that are sought are related to their employment and not completely unrelated.
Right, but if you remember, I also remember you're continuing that you were talking about a single incident. Is
That's
that not
still
correct?
in, yes.
That's correct.
That's
So-
still in the bill.
Okay. And it is your contention that if this amendment gets on, you're still going to support the bill?
Yes, I will support the bill if this amendment gets on. It's a good bill. It's a better bill as it is currently with the amendment. It's still a good bill, but it's not as good.
Thank you, Representative Seabaugh.
Representative Amity, is your question for Representative Seabaugh? For a question, Representative Amity.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Seabaugh, could you again give some real-life scenario where this phrase that we're dealing with, preponderance of evidence, how does that improve the bill, and how does the removal of that make the bill weaker?
All right, it improves the bill because it puts an evidentiary standard in the law that says if you're going to try to prove that the incident that caused you to have PTSD, to seek workers' compensation benefits, is related to your employment, it just sets up an evidentiary standard that says you have to prove that by preponderance of the evidence. There was actually some discussion of going to clear and convincing evidence, and we chose not to. We went with preponderance, which is an easier burden to reach. But it simply says, as it is now, before the amendment, that if someone is trying to make this claim, they have to prove by preponderance of the evidence that it was actually related to their employment rather than something unrelated. And the bill, when it originally came to us, it had certain presumptions that said if you're an employee, it's presumed to be related. Even if it was something completely unrelated, you could have a car wreck on the weekend on your personal time, but if you work for the department, it's presumed to be related. I don't think anybody, once that was pointed out, I don't think anybody in the room thought that was a good idea. That's why the amendment was agreed to.
Okay, and so right now, the amendment that we're dealing with at this moment would remove that phrase.
It would remove the phrase, "and which the preponderance of the evidence indicates that the event was a substantial contributing factor."
So that makes it go back to the original bill where just any stress, the car accident on the weekend.
I would presume, without this language, I'm not sure what the evidentiary standard would be. It might put the presumption back, it might not. I'm honestly not sure. I don't want to mislead anybody, but it takes the preponderance of the evidence out.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Representative Garofalo, is your question for Representative Seabaugh?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Garofalo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Seabaugh, so we're talking about a workers' comp claim where the employee was in the course and scope of his business, of his employment, correct?
Well, that's what we're trying to say. You have to, yes. And we're trying to, what the amendment would do is remove the preponderance of the evidence language from the burden of proof to prove that the event which occurred while you were in the course and scope of your employment was a contributing factor to your PTSD.
But the purpose of workers' comp is to compensate someone when they're working, correct?
Correct.
So this would simply make the person who's injured, who's claiming PTSD, prove that they had received or the PTSD was caused by the employment and not some other means.
As the bill is written currently, that's correct. If the amendment gets on, they would be removing the preponderance of the evidence language, which may reinstitute the presumption that it was related to the employment without them having to prove it.
Okay, all right, you've answered my question. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Connick, is your question for Representative Seabaugh? Question, Representative Connick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Seabaugh, if you oppose this amendment, correct?
Yeah, I don't like the amendment. I like the bill as we amended it in committee.
And if the amendment is not put on, this will make it difficult for firemen who have post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis to prove that case.
No, it simply puts the evidentiary standard at preponderance of the evidence. You have to prove by preponderance of the evidence, which is just a little bit more than half, that the event which occurred while you were employed is the cause of your PTSD.
And why is that such a big deal if you have an event and you got a diagnosis with that?
I don't know. I agree with you. I think the preponderance of the evidence is the easiest evidentiary standard that we have. If you take that out, I don't know what the evidentiary standard would be.
All right. Do you have anything against firemen?
Not at all. I like the bill. I've said I'd vote for it many times.
Thank you.
I don't particularly like workers' comp plaintiffs' lawyers.
We don't have any other questions on the amendment. For the floor on the amendment, Representative Horton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I appreciate Representative Seabaugh. I didn't get a chance to oppose this amendment because this author did accept it in committee. But I can tell you, as we all know, that presumption is rebutable. I mean, you can rebut that. I mean, we want to streamline the way that our firemen, first responders get help. The last thing they want to do is ask for help. And it's not from one incident. It's from a lot of years after year after year. I live with someone who is a Shreveport fireman, you all know, for almost 34 years in Shreveport. I mean, on the fire department, he's retired, but it was 5 years later when things started, he's been retired 10 years, things started coming up and coming up. He didn't know what was happening. These men need a streamlined way to get the help they need as soon as they need it, so they won't have to live with it the rest of their life like my husband has to. And I believe that Tanner McGee's amendment will streamline the effort. And trust me, no one will fake it. But you can't be presumed to have something if you don't. I mean, you can rebut that. There's doctors who can do that. It's already in the bill before the amendment was put on, and I do appreciate my colleague, and he knows that. But our first responders deserve to have a quick line for quick care so they can recover, and because trust me, they're going to continue to work. And I just appreciate you supporting this amendment. It's crucial to our men and women who risk their lives for us every day to get the quick and immediate help that they need so they can get on back to work. Thank you for your consideration.
For the floor on the amendment, Representative Cox.
Let me say that I am surprised that we don't already have something for them. But let me explain to you that PTSD does not just happen by one event. It can be one event. It can be accumulative events. So let me explain to you that this amendment is a great amendment for this, because what you're doing is you're trying to take a guy who's running the buildings, who put his life on the line. I was in the military. I tried to save people at times, but my other job was to take people out. This is a different story. I tell you a quick story about a fireman. A fireman there was a fire, and two little girls, twin girls, who died. They were in a fire, and they put them in a bag, and nobody could find the second one. So I was at home. I went in to try to help them figure out what had happened. So somebody said, maybe we should go unlock the bag. And we unlocked the bag, and they were in there. They died holding themselves together, these two girls. And the smell was so pungent that I couldn't eat turkey for a long time. That's how it smelled, like a roasted turkey. And I'm telling you, these guys have smells, they have sight, they have different events. This stuff happens over and over and over. Let me tell you what's happening to the most dangerous people in the world is the armed forces. And they're killing themselves, 22 people a day. And so are your policemen, so are the firefighters. No one's talked about it, but they are committing suicide. You know, listen, I'm asking you to vote for this amendment because I'm not talking to you about something I heard about. I'm not talking to you about something out of my mind. I'm talking about something that I deal with, and I know how this stuff works. But only by the grace of God do you really get through this thing. You can never get over this. Some people say you can be cured from it. I'm telling you, it's an ongoing thing. And if you don't pray every day about it, you're putting our people who are trying to help us in dire straits. And when they start deciding that they hurt somebody, I'm telling you, please listen to me, that these guys put their lives on the line every day, run into some building. There may be months before something happens. But once again, when it does happen, and then you will have said, oh, well, you got to have the preponderance of evidence and all of this. I'm telling you that they cannot fake this. And this is not something that we need to be against. If you have a question, I sure can answer.
Representative Miguez, while you rise.
Mr. Speaker, did the amendment get on, or are we on the bill or the amendment?
We're
on the amendment.
We still have people on the floor for the amendment. We have
Okay, because
three
the
more
last two people that spoke in favor of the amendment sounds like that was in favor of the bill. I'm just a little confused.
We're still on the amendment.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, so that I don't have to have my button punched for the floor, so I won't have to come back up here, you can take this speak for both.
We'll take you off
Thank
the
you,
floor.
Mr. Chairman.
That works.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For the floor and the amendment, Representative Stagney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I support the amendment. And I think what was put on in the Labor Committee significantly reduces the bill. If you say you want to help the firemen, the policemen, these are state troopers. If you say you want to help them, you don't give the insurance companies ammunition to delay their claims, because that's what's happening. We all just voted, I don't know, 3-4 bills ago that we're putting in law, because it was a promulgated rule about the 30 days in workers' comp. So, and this is nothing odd or new. Already in the law, presumptive, already in the law for firefighters, if they have cancer, heart disease, lung disease, it's presumed it was job related. And the reason is the statistics for those people that we asked to run into burning buildings to try to save babies and save lives, we need to protect them. When we ask them to do things your brain is not normally handling, we have to help them. Early intervention saves lives. Last year we had 14 firefighters commit suicide. It's a higher rate with emergency medical personnel. It makes a difference. This amendment makes all the difference in the world on whether they're going to get treated in a timely manner or not. I don't want to give anybody ammunition to hurt those people we're trying to help with this bill.
For the floor and the amendment, Representative Jefferson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members of the Louisiana House of Representatives. Again, thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the august opportunity to chair labor. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, this amendment, as you've heard, and I'll be very brief, gives us an opportunity to streamline, as Representative Seabaugh indicated, the presumption. But many of us who practice in other areas, you can overcome that presumption. The bill stipulates that. This, what Representative McGee is proposing, gives a streamline, gives a presumption, gives us an opportunity to give these men and women a more streamlined approach as relates to prove what they're going through, what they're enduring. We've heard a lot today about life, about liberty, about the pursuit of happiness. These individuals deal with this on a daily basis. This amendment will allow them to streamline, and still, it can be rebutted. And the bill, I'm not getting into the bill, but it can be rebutted. And again, there was no agreement as it relates to this. You've heard also, this is a good bill, a good piece of legislation, and I encourage and implore, beseech, beg each of you to follow Representative McGee and allow this amendment as it relates to this piece of legislation.
For the floor on the amendment, Representative Ivy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I rise in support of the amendment, and I serve on the Firefighters Retirement Board, and with regard to retirement benefits that may be avail themselves to someone who becomes permanently disabled, including with PTSD, it's a very serious issue. We had a young man who came and presented to the board appealing to have his the disability benefit approved because of PTSD. Watched a grown man cry, just reliving in his mind the trauma that of the things that he's experienced in the public service of his community. And so we voted earlier on a pro-life bill. I believe we should be consistent in supporting life. And the folks who risk life and limb to save ours, when they do experience the trauma that is associated with the job, and obviously it's at a much higher rate than any other profession, I believe we need to be there to support them. Any delays in giving them treatment, I believe, could have a significant impact. The suicide rate is so high, the devastation that it is that it can have on a family. We need to give them the support they need. So I do support that. Let's vote for life. Thanks.
For the floor on the amendment, Representative Bagley.
Give me a couple of seconds here. When Senator Gatti brought this bill to the committee, just as they walked in, my daughter called and said that Rusty Canton, we okayed this resolution yesterday. He was a fire chief in Logansport, committed suicide. It hit me pretty hard because my wife had committed suicide several years ago, so it really worked on me. I support Representative McGee's amendment. I hope you do too. Thank you.
There are no other members to speak on the amendment. Representative McGee, to close on your amendment. Representative McGee, will you take questions on your closing before we get to that point?
Yes, I would.
For question, Representative Miguez.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I wanted to ask some questions earlier. Thank you for taking the questions. On closing, did the author ask you to bring this amendment?
The fireman asked me to bring this amendment.
I
don't remember his name, to be honest with you. I did speak to him, and I was supposed to speak with him more, but it was a specific firefighter.
Have you had any conversation with Senator Gatti about this amendment?
I did have conversations with Senator Gatti about this amendment.
And can you tell me how that conversation went?
He said he was supportive of putting the amendment on.
Okay, he was?
Yes.
Okay, because in committee, I was understanding that the bill in that posture, as amended, was sort of an agreement we had to keep it in that posture, so he didn't agree with that.
I wasn't in the committee. I couldn't tell you.
Okay, so there's been a lot of talk about presumption and streamlining, and there's a lot of everyone that went to the floor to speak in favor of the amendment sounded like they spoke in favor of the bill. Wouldn't you agree?
You know, I don't try to put words in people's mouths. I think their own discussions.
But this bill, no matter if it's amended or not, helps firemen with PTSD, helps them, gives them a remedy, and regardless of whether this amendment gets on or not.
Yes.
So that would lead me to believe that they were speaking in favor of the bill. Wouldn't you agree?
I have no reason to deny that.
So what is the evidentiary standard if your amendment gets on? Currently in the bill, it's a preponderance of the evidence. What would it be?
We're trying to recreate the presumption, and here's the deal why. Is because when you're dealing with PTSD, it often can be difficult to have an exact moment of proof. And considering these are the first responders, we want to make sure that they get their treatment as fast as they possibly can, and they're not delayed by their employer sort of messing with them and making them go through some sort of extra hoops in order to get their treatment.
So what's the civil code standard for evidence?
Preponderance. But
So
look, I want to be.
you see where I'm coming here. Your amendment is going to keep preponderance.
I want to be very clear about something. The workers' comp has its own sort of realm in the law, and it adopts the civil code in the absence of any workers' comp statute, and they have a relaxed code of evidence in workers' comp. I would not profess to be an expert of workers' comp. That's the guidelines I can tell you from my limited experience of dealing with workers' comp.
So we're in agreement that it's a preponderance of evidence is likely the evidentiary standard.
In the civil code, yes.
Is there a lower evidentiary standard than preponderance of evidence?
No, there's not.
Is there a higher evidentiary standard?
Yes, there's
Yes.
several. There's clear and
So,
convincing, and then there's reasonable doubt.
You see why I'm sort of confused by some of the floor speeches that came before. We're talking about the same preponderance of evidence. So regardless of whether we're stating it or it'll just be what the evidentiary standard will be in its absence, it will be a preponderance of evidence. So I have to move on to the next part of which you're striking, which is the event was a substantially contributing factor. Don't you think that is required to make sure that it happened on the job?
Not really.
Because with this amendment getting on, all I will say is that it happened in the course and scope of employment. But if there's an issue that happened outside of the employment that was a substantial contributing factor, they can make a claim with this amendment getting on.
Sure, and the employer would have the opportunity, even without that. If you had the presumption, the employer had the opportunity to go out there and prove, it would shift whose burden it was. The employer would have to go out there and say, this is the reason why, instead of it being on the employee to say, this is the reason why. That's how presumptions work.
We received a floor note that said the amendment would place an undue burden on local government employers and their taxpayers, and please vote no on Representative McGee's amendment. Don't you agree that would put more of a burden on the taxpayers by removing the substantial contributing factor language, and it wouldn't narrowly tailor this, and you could have it would subject this to maybe abuse?
I don't believe firefighters would abuse the system. No.
So you don't agree with the framework in Texas on how they frame their statute to get this done by including this language?
I'm not in Texas. I don't know the breadth of their laws, so I couldn't tell you about one specific aspect.
But there has to be a reason they put that in the code, because it was a keep it to make sure that the bill did what it in fact you intended for it to do, which is we all want to help firefighters.
I know you do, Representative.
And I'm going to vote on this bill because I want to help firefighters,
Sure.
But I'm worried about it being opened up. And the same thing that the people said on the floor note out, we have that concern. And you're not concerned about that?
No, I don't believe that firefighters can abuse the system. I believe that firefighters suffering PTSD, need a fast route to get to there. I don't want to make it unduly burdensome on them.
So the only thing that your amendment does, because the preponderance of evidence is the same, regardless if this amendment gets on or not. We've already talked about that earlier. The only thing this does is removes that a substantial contributing factor that this happened on the job.
Yes.
That's the only net effect.
Well, the intent was to try and put the presumption back. If it doesn't do that, but that's the intent, and we're also trying to remove the substantial factor as well.
Okay, thank you. Thank you,
welcome.
Representative.
Thank you.
Representative Ivey, is your question for Representative McGee? It is. Representative Ivey for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative McGee, with regard to the process for us non-attorneys out there and who couldn't quite follow all the legalese that was just discussed, could you explain what would happen to the firefighter if we don't add this amendment with regard to treatment and...
He would have to go out and prove that there was a specific event that took place within the course and scope of his employment that specifically caused the PTSD. And so if it happened over time, if it was a series of events, it'd be difficult for him to do so.
So we're going to ask someone who is suffering from PTSD to try and defend their PTSD and identify all the specific traumas that were associated with, the condition.
Correct.
Okay, and Now, what are the benefits that are available, throughout this process, just in generally? What benefits are we trying to achieve for the firefighters?
We're trying to get them mental health treatment. At the end of the day, that's really what you're going for.
So, obviously, the mental health treatment is the most critical component.
Members, just a minute. Representative Dustin Miller, why do you rise?
Mr. Speaker, it's getting late. Can we enact the 3-minute rule?
Are you making that motion?
For the rest of the night, yes, sir.
Is there any objection to the adoption of the 3-minute rule? Representative Pilot, why do you rise?
I object because I've tried to do that several times and they objected me.
Representative Miller has offered the 3-minute rule, to which Representative Pilot has objected. When the clerk opens the machines, all those in favor of the 3-minute rule vote yes. Those opposed vote no. The clerk will open the machine. Vote your machines, members. Representative Stagney, yes. Representative Jefferson, yes. Representative Cox, yes. Representative Greg Miller, yes. Representative Lyons, yes. Representative Arms, yes. Representative White, yes. Representative Adams, yes. Representative Smith, yes. Clerk will close the machine. 76 yeas, 14 nays. The 3-minute rule is now in effect for the rest of the evening. Members, that means, let me remind you, that means the person at the well has 3 minutes. If one person uses those 3 minutes, he's done. Continue on, Representative Ivey.
Hello? Okay, thank you. Trying to get back to where I was. The nature of the real benefit is the treatment for
the mental health treatment, yes.
PTSD. The workers' comp component from a financial standpoint it's a minimal benefit. No one's trying to get rich off of workers' comp, correct?
Actually, you only get 2/3 of your average weekly wage, so you get you get a third less of your salary. It's not a very good benefit at the end of the day.
Okay, and so without this amendment, what type of delays would this cause with regard to getting the treatment that our firefighters need?
It could not only delay, it could destroy a firefighter's opportunity to get the treatment he needs, because it could be too difficult for him to actually prove the thing. So it could ultimately make it so arduous that he would not be able to do it.
So the threshold of having to prove a mental disorder associated with work trauma can be too much for them to even try to attempt. And
yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Jay Morris for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative McGee, the requirement of proof could require the hiring of a physician to try to establish causation, right?
Absolutely.
And that's going to run up the cost.
That will run up the cost.
And not only delay, but run up the cost for a physician. And then it can be the battle of the physician. So the other side hires a physician that says, no, it was caused by something else. So this kind of eliminates that needless burden of proof.
That is absolutely correct.
Thank
Great
you.
point.
For a question, Representative Marino.
So, Representative McGee, your amendment is going to help firefighters quickly get the treatment that they need.
Yes, and look, I was going to say it for closing, but I really believe that there's nothing more tragic than when a first responder, like a firefighter, suffering from PTSD, and they do something in a criminal way, and they have to suffer the consequences of that. And to me, that is the biggest tragedy, because they didn't get the mental health aspect they needed. So we can avoid that with this.
Thank you for your amendment.
For a question, Representative Cruz. He's got about 40 seconds left.
Representative McGee.
Oh wait, he's waiving questions at this point.
I'll take Raymond. I'll take Representative Cruz's.
Okay, now you have 37 seconds.
My biggest question is, what I don't understand is, I was in the committee and the author was completely fine with this amendment, as were the firefighter representatives there, which I was texting. I don't understand the genesis of the idea to remove the ideas we had there.
That was in the original bill. I wasn't in committee. I can't answer that for you.
Well, I'm just wondering if the author or the union or somebody told you, well, here's why we want that, because they didn't have any problem in the committee.
I wasn't in committee. I can't help you.
Members, Representative McGee has offered an amendment to which Representative Seabaugh has objected. When the clerk opens the machines, those in favor of the amendment vote yes. Those opposed vote no. The clerk will open the machine. Vote your machines, members. Are you through voting? Representative Stagney, yes. Representative Arms, yes. Representative Abraham, yes. Representative Huval, no. Representative Hodges, yes. Representative McFarland, no. Are you through voting? Are you through voting? Clerk will close the machine. 74 yeas, 24 nays, and the amendment's been adopted. Are there any other amendments, Madam Clerk? For a question on the bill, Representative Pilot.
We going in when y'all coming out. I want to tell you something.
Representative Pilot, do you have a question on the bill?
Just calling me.
Oh, I'm sorry. Representative Stagney is now waiving questions.
I have to waive questions. I'm limited to 3 minutes, and there were some points I needed to make. Very quickly, I'd like everyone to realize this is not only firefighters. This is our state troopers, our city municipal employees.
Representative Stagney, just a minute. Representative Pilot, why do you rise?
Mr. Speaker, I had my button pushed for quite some time, and I don't want anybody to misunderstand. This doesn't include all law enforcement officers.
Wait, you had your question button pushed, which I recognized you, but he waived questions.
Yes, sir.
So we're down to the last 3 minutes on his closing.
But people
now.
need to know that sheriff's deputies not included.
You can continue, Representative.
Thank you. And the reason sheriff's deputies are not included is, believe it or not, they're not in a normal workers' comp program that everyone else is in. So they opted, they wanted to be out. They have a special type of workers' comp self-insurance that they do themselves. They didn't want to be in the bill when the bill started. As far as finding out whether they have PTSD, it has to be diagnosed by a psychiatrist or a psychologist. It can't be any other type of MD or any other type of provider. When we were talking about the presumption of evidence, in the bill it specifically says you can rebut the length of the time between the beginning and the end of the period of employment and the date of diagnosis, whether there's been any traumatic events between the beginning and the end period of employment and the date of the diagnosis, and whether the individual diagnosed has been previously diagnosed with post-traumatic stress injury or prior to that employment. So even though you're shifting the burden from the injured employee that we all value so greatly to the insurance company to allow that treatment to take place, that's all this is doing. It is streamlining the process. It's not the first time it's been done. Again, it's already a presumption that if those, especially firefighters, get cancer, heart disease, lung, any of that stuff, it's presumed that it happened at work. But you have a rebuttable challenge to that as well. I'd ask for your support on the bill.
Representative Stagney moves final passage of the bills. Many in favor of final passage vote yes. Those opposed vote no. The clerk will open the machine. Vote your machines, members. Representative McFarland, yes. Representative Pugh, yes. Representative Bacala, yes. Representative Bagley, yes. Are you through voting? Representative Edmonds, yes. Are you through voting? Clerk will close the machine. 99 yeas, 0 nays. The bill is finally passed. Representative Stagney moves to reconsider the vote. The bill finally passed and lay that motion on the table without objection. So ordered.